So let's talk about August 15th, 2025. You had U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin meeting up in Anchorage, Alaska. Now, the whole point of this was a huge, high-stakes summit, right? They were trying to figure out how to end the war in Ukraine. But what really went down at this pretty historic and definitely controversial meeting? All right, let's break it down.
You know, to really get why this summit was such a big deal, we actually have to start here. These are some pretty provocative billboards that started popping up in Russia. It's a phrase just loaded with historical irony because, and you gotta love this, the very place where these two leaders decided to meet, yeah, it was actually Russian land once upon a time.
Yep, you heard that right. Picking Alaska wasn't just, finding a convenient spot on the map. Oh no. The location was absolutely steeped in history. It basically turned the whole thing into this big reminder of a wild, 158-year-old land deal. So here's the backstory. Way back when, after Russia lost the Crimean War, they looked at Alaska and thought, man, this place is expensive and a real headache to defend, especially from Great Britain. So what did they do? In 1867, they sold it to the U.S. for a measly $7.2 million. People at the time thought it was a joke. They called it Seward's Folly. And all of that history just adds this kind of surreal layer to this 2025 meeting, doesn't it?
Okay, so fast forward to 2025. How in the world did we get here? Well, the road to this Alaska Summit was, honestly, a total roller coaster. We're talking threats, crazy deadlines, and then this huge, dramatic pivot at the last second that had pretty much every expert scratching their heads, wondering what on earth was happening.
It all kicked off with this surprise phone call, right? Then, for the next few months, Trump was basically saying, look, peace talks are only going to happen if Putin and I meet face to face. Things really heated up in July when he slapped a 50-day deadline on Russia to end the war, a deadline that then got shrunk down like crazy. And then, get this, on the very last day, when everyone was expecting these massive sanctions, we got something totally different, an announcement for a summit in Alaska. Wild.
And you have to understand, the stakes here were just through the roof. I mean, just a few weeks before this meeting, you have Russia's Dmitry Medvedev talking about the dead hand, which is this old-school Soviet automatic nuclear launch system, a terrifying thought. Trump's response? He immediately announced he was moving 2 U.S. nuclear subs toward Russia. So yeah, this was not your standard quiet diplomatic chat. This whole thing was happening under a very real nuclear shadow.
Which of course brings us to the actual day of the summit. The arrival in Anchorage? Man, it was pure political theater. Just an absolute masterclass in symbolism and pageantry, all of it perfectly choreographed for the world's cameras. The messaging started before anyone even said a word. You had the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, stepping off the plane in a sweatshirt. And what did it say? SSR, the letters for the USSR. I mean, talk about a not-so-subtle, defiant nod to Soviet power. Then you have the two leaders themselves. They meet up on this special platform right there on the tarmac. They do the handshake for the cameras. And, all around them, American F-22 Raptor jets. A very clear, very deliberate show of U.S. military muscle.
And just when you thought it couldn't get more dramatic, right as they're posing for pictures, the whole spectacle just kicks into another gear. A B-2 stealth bomber and a bunch more F-22s roar right over their heads in this massive flyover. It's such a wild image, right? A handshake for peace happening right under the wings of some of the deadliest warplanes on the planet.
Okay, so after all that show for the cameras, it was time to get down to business. The two leaders and their top people, we're talking 3 aides on each side. They vanished behind closed doors, and they were in there for almost 3 hours. So what came out of it? After all the flyovers and the secret talks, what was the actual result? That's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? Did this summit actually lead to a breakthrough, or was it all just a really expensive photo op that didn't change a thing?
Well, the first clues we got were from the leaders themselves. And honestly, their stories didn't exactly match up. You had Putin coming out and talking about an agreement they reached. But then you had Trump, who sounded way more cautious. He said things like, we haven't quite gotten there, and made it super clear. There's no deal until there's a deal.
That kind of confusion, well, it split the experts right down the middle. On one side, you've got people like the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. He was not impressed. He basically called the whole thing a nothing burger, saying, where's the beef? There's nothing there.
But then, on the other hand, you have analysts like George Beebe from the Quincy Institute. He saw things totally differently. His take was, okay, maybe they didn't sign a final deal, but they did manage to hash out the outline of a framework deal. And that, he argued, was a really crucial first step. So let's just put the opinions aside for a second and look at what we know for a fact, what actually happened. While there was no ceasefire agreed upon, the leaders took zero questions from the press, a bigger follow-up meeting they had planned got cut short, and maybe most importantly, while all this talking was going on, Russian forces were still attacking in Ukraine. Those are the cold, hard facts that everyone's arguing about.
Which brings us to the big question. What happens next? And maybe more to the point, who really won here? With no clear deal on the table, who actually walked away from Alaska with the upper hand?
It's interesting because you can really make a solid case for both sides. If you're arguing Putin won, you'd say, hey, he broke out of his diplomatic isolation, he pushed back the threat of new sanctions, and he got this huge meeting without really giving up any ground. But if you're arguing Trump won, you'd say, well, he avoided getting locked into a bad deal, he put his own political neck on the line for peace, and he kept all his leverage by saying nothing's agreed until everything is agreed.
And what was the very next thing that happened? Well, after the summit, Trump immediately shifted the pressure. He went on Fox News and basically put the ball in Kyiv's court, saying, now it's really up to President Zelensky to get it done.
So that's where we're left, with this massive, lingering question. Was the 2025 Alaska Summit, with all its imperial history and military might, a genuine, if messy, first step towards peace? Or was it just a strategic victory for Putin, a grand spectacle that, in the end, didn't change a single thing on the ground? The truth is, that's a chapter of history that's still being written.